A large part of logical or technical access control are things we've talked about already. This is the authentication part of the IAAA model where I said I am Thor and I now have to prove that with multi-factor authentication. Now what I get access to on which type of access control models we use depends on our organization and what is important to us. So we have done the authentication, now we do the authorization. And we use the different types of access control models to determine what a subject is allowed to access. And this is a good point to tie this back to the basics of all IS, IT, and cybersecurity, the CIA Triad. If confidentiality is more important than everything else, we would most likely use mandatory access control. Now, if availability was more important, we would likely go with discretionary access control, and if integrity is most important, then we would either choose RBAC, role-based access control, or ABAC, attribute-based access control. And just to make sure you don't confuse any of these with rule-based access control, RBAC, that is what we use for our firewalls. If this happens, then do that. It's the if-then statements. Since we have already talked about these, I'm not going to go super much in depth, but for the curriculum, but logical access control makes sense both to have here and in domain 1. So let's look at DAC again, discretionary access control. And as the name indicates, this is based on the discretion of the data owner. It is at their discretion who and what they grant access to. The data owner can add and remove rights, or they can remove the access entirely. This is what most operating systems use. You can share your drive or a folder on that drive with someone else, and it uses DACLs, discretionary access lists. For specific folders, someone can grant me read and write access to one folder, but not to another. And most of the places where you're going to see DAC is maybe on shared drives. If you are in an organization in the private sector and you have role-based access control, you can still have discretionary access control within that. So you have a shared drive with all the files for your team. But the issue here is that we need someone who keeps track of all the files in there because we need to make sure that there are no orphaned files. Meaning if it's just somewhere where we stuff everything, very soon it's going to get cluttered and you can't really find anything. There's just too much stuff we don't use anymore. On top of that, people also choose to protect their files with passwords. But what happens when they leave? And this is a critical file. If we don't have that password, that file is no longer usable. And how I talked about we can use discretionary access control within role-based access control, that's really true for many of the combinations. We don't have to have one or another. We can have one major access control type. In most private companies and organizations, it's role-based or attribute-based, but then below that, in certain areas, we can have other types. Next up, we have MAC, mandatory access control. And you can tell from the name, right? This is more serious. It's mandatory. Here, confidentiality is most important, and access to objects is determined by labels and clearance. Subjects have clearance, objects have labels, subjects can manipulate objects, some things can be both but not at the same time, and the clearance have to be equal to or supersede the label. If you logic your way through it a few times, it will make sense. If we have a program that does our backups, if you go in and you configure things, at that point, that program is the object. It's being manipulated by you. Now, at midnight when our backups start, the backup program is now the subject. It goes out and pulls all the data that we need from the servers we're backing up. The servers are the object. Alright, back to MAC. And MAC is heavily used in the military and with defense contractors, which makes sense, right? We want to keep those secrets very secret. There are a few places I have seen it in the private sector, but again here, it's places where if we're compromised, the consequences could be really grave. And when I say the clearance must dominate the object's label, meaning it has to be equal to or higher than, it's not always that simple. If this is military, even if you have top secret, doesn't mean you can see everything that's top secret. You're going to have specific that can be top secret, nuclear, submarine. Well, then you can access top secret material about nuclear submarines. But here again, just because you can doesn't mean you're allowed to. There could also be a need to know here. Then we have RBAC, role-based access control. We have touched on that a couple of times. This is when integrity is most important, and this is what the vast majority of the private sector uses. It's policy-neutral access control, and it's defined around roles and privileges, and access is assigned to a job role. You are a cybersecurity analyst, well then you get cybersecurity analyst rights. If you are a network administrator, well then you get network administrator rights. And this most of the time comes with a need to know. We give you access to way more than you need to do your day-to-day job. But for you to be allowed to access that data, you have to have a need to know. This was the example I had with the doctors. They are allowed to access that specific patient's records if they are treating them. There was a case when Natalie Sulman, the woman that had 8 babies, Octomom, when she gave birth, part of her information was leaked to the press. We don't know who did it, but there were 15 employees at Kaiser that were not treating her. By accessing her records, they violated the need to know. And all of those nurses and doctors either got reprimanded or fired. And if you look at the image here, how the different roles of the thousands of users and their tens of thousands of permissions we have become much easier to manage. So everybody has access to the general role. They have email, they have time cards, they have employee records. And then we have a list with access control rights for that specific job. So as a cybersecurity analyst, you have the general role, you have IT role, you might have a cybersecurity analyst role. So anyone that joins us, we don't just make a copy of my access rights for the new employee, we have a role for cybersecurity analysts and they get assigned that. And the reason we don't just copy an existing user profile and use that as the template for the new one, I know many places do this, is because what if I have other roles? What if I'm not only the cybersecurity analyst? What if I have access to the data center or to some of the networking equipment? So we give the new users the access using the template for that specific position, and if anything needs to be changed, we change it, but we also document it very, very clearly. And if anyone ever changes roles within the organization, we need to remove the old rights and add the new rights. That way Bob doesn't move from making the purchase orders to signing the checks and keeps both rights so he can both make the order and pay for it. That's just trouble asking to happen. Role-based access control is by far the most common type of access control, but there is a shift towards ABAC, attribute-based access control, so let's look at that now. With ABAC, we have the same subjects and objects, but we also have environmental conditions. That was the one where if I'm a cybersecurity analyst, I don't have rights to enter the data center, but if I'm working on a project for the server team and I need to be in the data center because of that environmental condition, I now have access to the data center. It is the who, what, where, when, why, and how. We can also configure it to where nurses can only access records for patients they're actively treating. If they try to access anything else, they will get denied. This is probably not the best place to be super aggressive about this, because sometimes they are going to be treating patients before they have them assigned. In that case, we might just have a confirmation screen saying something like, "We don't see this being an active patient of yours. Are you sure you want to access this patient record?" Then there's some sort of disclaimer. There might be consequences if you access this patient record and you should not. So with attribute-based access control, it's much more granular and it's more secure than role-based access control. But here, we also need to make sure, because it is so complex, it is more granular, we also need to configure it completely right. This is going to take more time, but it will give us much more flexibility in our organization. Today, it's used in maybe 25% of large enterprises, and we expect that to be up to 70% within the next 5 years. In most places, you are going to see it as ABAC attribute-based, but you can see it some other places as policy-based or claims-based access control. And then let's revisit context and content-based access control, and some of what we do in context-based access control can be rolled into ABAC, attribute-based. Here, access and access control is based on certain contextual parameters. That's why it's context-based. We can give subjects access based on their time or their location. It can be a sequence of responses, their access history, or some sort of other context. That's what we did at that bank. The credit card department can log in to those programs half an hour outside of their normal work hours from the PCs only at the location. Meaning if I worked in that credit card department, and even if I couldn't log in remotely, if I try to log in to my PC outside of my normal work hours, I won't get access. It could also be a challenge response mechanism, like what is your favorite stuffed toy animal? Where do you like to go on vacation? Access is granted based on the context and what they're trying to access. If any of those parameters are not met, access is denied. And context really just means circumstances. If the circumstances aren't right, you don't get access. And you need to not confuse this with content-based access control. The content is what you're trying to access. If we go back to the hospital example, we have the same program that are used by nurses, doctors, physical therapists, pharmacists. Depending on their job role, they get shown one set of information and one set of menus. Nurses and pharmacists are going to see different things because different things are important to them. So really, content-based access control is really us hiding or showing menus and information in the applications, the views, the databases, access to confidential information based on the subject and the content they're trying to access. Now that you have a basic understanding of the high-level models, let's take a look at some of the specific ones you may need to know for the exam. I say may because I have not seen it on any exam outlines, but I kept having people every so often say they got 1 or 2 questions on them, so to help you prepare better, I added them to my course. We start out with 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is only focused on confidentiality, and it is mandatory access control. It was developed by the U.S. Department of Defense, and it is a state machine model. It is only focused on keeping our secrets secret, confidentiality. It does not care about integrity or availability. I personally have never seen it implemented, but that could be because of the military applications. For the exam, just know that it is mandatory access control and that it is only focused on confidentiality. And then these 3 properties. The simple security property states you cannot read up. Very simplified, someone with secret clearance cannot read top secret documents. No read up. Then we have this star security property, which is no write down. Here, subjects with top secret clearance cannot write to secret folders. Again, it makes sense. We don't want someone with top secret clearance sharing that information with people who only have secret clearance. And then finally we have the strong star property, no read or write up and down, which means that only subjects on that specific level can read whatever information is at that level. And which property we choose to implement depends on what we are protecting. And now let's look at 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. 𝗏𝗏𝗏 is also mandatory access control, but the whole purpose of 𝗏𝗏𝗏 is data integrity. It does not care about confidentiality. It does not care about availability. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 was also developed by the US DoD, and it is a state transition model. It also has 3 properties or axioms, but remember, the focus is integrity. The simple integrity axiom is no read down. An example of this could be people with top secret clearance cannot read secret information, not because we care that they have access to the data, but more because we don't want any lower-level wrong information to confuse people or to influence them if they have higher clearance. Again, it is integrity. Then we have the star integrity axiom that is no write up. Subjects with secret clearance cannot write information to top secret folders because we don't want their lower-level, inferior knowledge to influence and propagate to higher levels. And then finally, the invocation property, no read or write up. Here again, we don't want subjects on a lower level to influence or change data on a higher level. So 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, integrity, mandatory access control, state transition model, and then there are 3 axioms or properties. Which then brings us to lattice-based access control, or LBAC. This is also mandatory access control. When we cover clearance later, we will look at how you don't just have top secret clearance, you have top secret, nuclear submarine, something something. If you look on the graphics over here on the right, you can see why it is called lattice-based access control, because it kind of looks like a lattice that you would have in a garden or in a fence where the plants are growing up it, and these in reality are much, much more complex. There can be thousands of different options in that lattice. But for the exam, just know what they are, then it kind of looks like it does over here on the right, and that it is mandatory access control. You may also hear it referred to as label-based access control, and it was first formally defined by Dorothy Denning in 1976. And the reason I mentioned her is because first off, she's an awesome information security researcher, and secondly, she was also part of the Graham-Denning model, which is the next one we're going to cover. The Graham-Denning model uses objects, subjects, and rules, and it has 8 rules for access, objects, and subjects. And a subject can transfer, grant or delete access, read, create or destroy an object, and then finally create or destroy a subject. It is commonly used in distributed systems, and that is probably the extent you need to know about it for the exam. That then brings us to HRU, Harrison, Russo, and Ullman. It is based on an extension of the Graham-Denning model, and it is an operating system level security model that focuses on the integrity of access rights to the system. It is based on the idea that a finite set of procedures should be available to edit the access rights of a subject on an object. And unlike Graham-Denning, it also considers subjects to be objects. The first four of the primitive operations should be familiar: create object, create subject, destroy object. The last two are, however, new: enter and delete rights from an access matrix. As you can tell by now, with these security models, you don't need anything in depth, but you need to understand how each of them work and be able to spot the keywords. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.